My name is Demi, and at 32 years old, I never thought I would be sitting across a courtroom aisle from the man who gave me life. I watched my father, Robert Porter, lean over and tenderly rub the swollen belly of a woman younger than me. He whispered something in her ear that made her giggle, a sound that echoed inappropriately off the high mahogany walls of the family court. He looked like the picture of a proud, expectant father. But I knew the truth. I knew that the charcoal gray Armani suit he was wearing, crisp, tailored, and expensive, was bought with the money my mother had desperately needed for her final round of chemotherapy. He didn't buy her the medicine. He bought himself a suit to look good at her funeral, and now he was wearing it to strip her daughter of everything she had left. They thought they had already won. They thought I was just the grieving, weak daughter who would roll over and die. But they didn't know what was in the sealed manila envelope resting under my lawyer's hand. Before I tell you what happened when that envelope was opened, and believe me, you want to hear this, please tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And if you believe that family loyalty shouldn't be a one-way street, hit that subscribe button. You might just find the strength you need in my story. The air in the courtroom smelled like stale coffee, old wood polish, and hypocrisy. It was a suffocating scent that seemed to stick to the back of my throat. I sat perfectly still, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, trying to stop them from trembling. I wasn't shaking from fear. I was shaking from a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. Judge Miller was reviewing the documents, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his pen against the bench serving as a countdown to my execution. Or so my father hoped. On the other side of the aisle, the performance was in full swing. Tiffany, my father's companion, a 24-year-old former barista with a taste for designer handbags and other women's husbands, shifted dramatically in her seat. She placed a manicured hand on her lower back and let out a soft, pained gasp. "Oh, Robert," she whispered, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "The baby is kicking so hard today. He's a fighter, just like his daddy." Robert beamed. He actually beamed. He turned to her, ignoring the solemnity of the court, and placed his large hand over hers on her stomach. "Easy now, sweetheart. He's just eager to get out here and take charge. A son. Finally, a son to carry the Porter name." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Finally, a son. I was sitting right there, his daughter, the one who had managed his accounts for 10 years, the one who had wiped his brow when he had the flu, the one who had sat by Mom's bedside for 6 agonizing months while he was working late, which I later learned meant dinners with Tiffany at Le Bernardin. To him, I was invisible. I was a placeholder that had expired. Tiffany caught me staring. She didn't look away. Instead, a small pitying smile played on her lips. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Don't be sad, Demi. You know how it is. Men need heirs. It's just biology, honey. You understand, right?" I felt the bile rise in my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap over the divider and tear that smug look off her face. I wanted to ask my father how he could quote the Bible on Sundays and destroy his family on Mondays. But then I heard my father's voice booming as he addressed his lawyer, not even bothering to lower his volume. He wanted me to hear this. He wanted the judge to hear this. "Look, we need to wrap this up," Robert said, adjusting his silk tie. "Demi is fragile. She's always been emotional, just like her mother. She can't handle the estate. If you give her access to Sarah's life insurance, she'll just waste it on therapy or some nonsense. It's better if I hold it in a trust for her. For her own good. For my own good." The audacity was breathtaking. He was trying to paint me as incompetent to steal the only financial security my mother had left me, all to fund his new life with Tiffany and their heir. My knuckles turned white. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders, threatening to crush me right there on the bench. I felt tears pricking my eyes, not of sorrow, but of sheer, impotent frustration. "God, where are you?" I screamed internally. "Why are you letting this happen?" And then, as if a switch had been flipped, a verse from Sunday school floated up from the depths of my memory. Psalm 27:10. "When my father and my mother forsake me, Then the Lord will take me up. My mother had whispered that to me days before she passed. I hadn't understood it then. I did now. The tears in my eyes didn't fall. They evaporated, replaced by a dry, burning clarity. My father had forsaken me. He had chosen a replacement. He had made his choice clear in front of God and the law. And that meant I owed him nothing. No more respect, no more silence, no more dutiful daughter. Beside me, Mark, my mother's old estate attorney, a man who had known me since I was in pigtails, placed a heavy, calming hand on my arm. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on Robert. Mark was a man of few words, a shark in a cheap suit, the complete opposite of my father's flashy legal team. "Easy, Demi," Mark murmured, his voice a low rumble that only I could hear. "Don't say a word. Don't give them the satisfaction of an outburst. Let the silence make them uncomfortable." "They're lying, Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. "They're taking everything." "They think they are," Mark corrected. He slowly stood up. The movement drew the room's attention. Even the judge stopped tapping his pen. Mark didn't pick up a stack of files. He didn't pick up a laptop. He picked up a single, thick manila envelope that had been sealed with red tape. Robert glanced over, a flicker of confusion crossing his arrogant face. He didn't recognize the envelope. Why would he? He hadn't been home enough in the last year to know what my mother had been doing in her final weeks. Mark buttoned his jacket. He looked at the judge, then turned his gaze briefly to my father. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of pity. "Your Honor," Mark said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Before you rule on the distribution of assets, there is a piece of evidence that has just come to light. Or rather, come into effect." I looked at my father one last time. He was still holding Tiffany's hand, looking annoyed at the interruption, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to crumble. They wanted a fight. They wanted to talk about legacy. Mark ripped the red tape off the envelope. The sound was the loudest thing in the room. The sharp sound of Mark ripping that red tape off the envelope echoed in the silent courtroom. But in my mind, the noise didn't stop. It twisted and elongated, morphing from the tear of paper into a rhythmic, mechanical hiss that I knew too well. Hiss, click, hiss, click. That haunting rhythm dragged me backward, pulling me violently out of the high-ceilinged mahogany courtroom and dropping me onto the cold hardwood floor of my childhood living room 3 months ago. The air around me shifted instantly. The smell of stale coffee vanished, replaced by the sharp chemical tang of antiseptic and the underlying sweet odor of decay. It was the night the hospice nurse had left us for the final time. I had been awake for 36 hours straight, curled up like a child, watching Sarah Porter, the woman who taught me how to bake apple pie and balance a checkbook, slowly vanish into the sheets. The only sound in the world was that machine breathing for her, until the front door slammed, shattering the vigil. Heavy footsteps clattered in the foyer, followed by the metallic clank of a golf bag hitting the floor. "Jesus, it smells like a hospital in here," a voice boomed, destroying the sanctity of the moment. My father walked into the living room, wearing a bright yellow polo shirt, his face flushed with a sunburn from 18 holes at the country club. He didn't look at Mom. He looked at the half-empty glass of water on the nightstand with a frown. "Demi, did you call the insurance company about the morphine copay?" he asked, walking past the dying woman to pour himself a drink. "They're trying to screw us on the deductible." I stared at him, eyes burning from exhaustion. "Dad?" "She's barely breathing." He took a swig of bourbon, the ice clinking in his glass. As he moved closer, a nauseating smell hit me. It wasn't just the alcohol. It was the stale reek of cigar smoke layered over a floral, cloying perfume. Chanel No. 5. My mother hadn't worn perfume in 2 years, and she hated Chanel. "She's been barely breathing for a week," he muttered, glancing at his wife of 35 years as if she were a leaky faucet he hadn't gotten around to fixing. "She's fighting it too hard. It's costing a fortune." He walked out to watch the football game, leaving me alone with the truth he refused to see. An hour later, Mom opened her eyes one last time. They were cloudy, but she squeezed my hand with a grip as frail as a bird's wing. "Demi," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves. The closet, cedar chest, under, the loose board, blue box. I don't understand, I cried softly. Your father. She closed her eyes, a single tear leaking out. He thinks. I don't know. But I know. The blue box. It's yours. Those were the last words she ever spoke. She died just before dawn, and when I went to tell my father, the only response I got was the sound of him snoring in his recliner, an infomercial blaring on the TV. That image of him sleeping while she was gone burned into my retinas, fading only when the stark, theatrical reality of the funeral took its place days later. The service at the First Baptist Church felt less like a goodbye and more like a stage play where Robert Porter was the lead actor. He stood on the podium, dabbing dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, claiming Sarah was the light of his life and his soulmate. But from the front row, I saw the truth. His eyes weren't on the cross or the coffin. They were scanning the pews, assessing the widows and single women like he was shopping for a used car. The performance didn't end at the pulpit. It followed us back to the house for the reception. The dining room table groaned under the weight of the traditional American funeral potluck, aluminum trays of green bean casserole, potato salad, and store-bought cookies brought by neighbors. While I stood numbly by the punch bowl, my father leaned in to whisper to Uncle Jerry. I can't believe the cost of the flowers, he complained, his voice low but audible. $5,000 for lilies that are going to die in a day. Sarah certainly knew how to rack up a bill, even at the end. Sickened, I retreated to the kitchen to escape him, only to find the source of the Chanel No. 5 standing right there. Tiffany. She was out of place, too young, wearing a black dress that was too tight and too short. Hi, she chirped, holding a tray of lasagna. I'm Tiffany. I'm from, the prayer group. Mr. Porter, mentioned how much he loves lasagna. My mother didn't go to a prayer group, I said flatly. Oh, it's an online group, she lied effortlessly, breezing past me to place the food in front of my father. I watched from the doorway as his mask of grief vanished. His eyes lit up, and he placed a hand on her arm, a touch that lingered far too long. She whispered something, and he actually smirked. In the middle of my mother's wake, surrounded by her friends, my father was flirting with a girl young enough to be his daughter. The realization hit me harder than the rain that started to fall as I walked out the back door a few minutes later. I stood in the yard, shivering in the cold dampness, staring at the dark tree line. The man laughing inside wasn't my father. He was a stranger. I was an orphan. But as the rain mixed with my tears, Mom's whisper echoed in my head again. The blue box. I wiped my face, a cold resolve settling over me. I wasn't going back inside to cry. I was going back inside to find the weapon my mother had left me. I found the blue box my mother had whispered about, a heavy cedar-smelling thing tucked under a loose floorboard in the back of her closet. And I hid it deep inside my old college trunk. I didn't open it immediately. I couldn't. Because less than 48 hours after I pulled that box from the floor, my childhood home ceased to be a home and transformed into occupied territory. It started with the boxes. A mountain of brown cardboard with the smiling Amazon Arrow logo began piling up on the front porch. Every single day, the delivery truck backed into our driveway, dropping off packages that Tiffany had ordered. And the worst part wasn't the sheer volume of consumption. It was the name on the shipping labels, Sarah Porter. Tiffany was using my dead mother's Amazon Prime account, charging thousands of dollars of bedding, curtains, and high-end electronics to a credit card that my father should have canceled days ago. The house just smells old, Tiffany announced one morning, wrinkling her nose as she walked into the kitchen. She was wearing a silk robe that I recognized. It was the one my father had given Mom for their 25th anniversary. We need to freshen it up. For the baby. I was standing at the counter, making toast, trying to make myself as small as possible. That smell is lavender and history, I muttered. It's my mother. She ignored me, opening the pantry door with a critical eye. And this junk needs to go. Before I could stop her, she reached onto the middle shelf and grabbed 3 mason jars. They were filled with homemade strawberry jam, the last batch my mother had preserved the summer before she got sick. Those jars were precious to me. They were a Sunday morning tradition, a memory of red-stained fingers and laughter in a steaming kitchen. Crash. The sound of glass shattering against the inside of the trash can made me jump. "What are you doing?" I gasped, dropping my toast. "Making space," she said breezily, not even looking at me as she swept the remaining jars into the garbage. "I ordered a new line of organic skincare from France, and it needs to be stored in a cool, dark place. This shelf is perfect." I looked into the trash can. The red jam was oozing over coffee grounds and eggshells mixed with broken glass. My mother's labor, her love, her time, all discarded to make room for face cream. My hands balled into fists at my sides, my fingernails digging into my palms until they bled. I wanted to scream, to drag her out of the house by her hair. But I remembered the blue box upstairs. I remembered Mark's warning: silence. The torture didn't stop at the pantry. By Sunday, the house had been purged. Black garbage bags lined the hallway, stuffed to the brim with my mother's clothes, her shoes, her books. Tiffany had labeled them all Goodwill with a thick black marker. It wasn't charity, it was an erasure. "We're having a Sunday roast tonight," my father announced that afternoon, looking up from his iPad. "Tiffany is craving pot roast. Make sure the carrots are glazed the way I like them, Demi." He didn't ask if I would cook. He assumed it. I was no longer his daughter. I was the live-in help who didn't require a paycheck. I spent 4 hours in the kitchen, roasting the beef, peeling potatoes, and making the gravy from scratch just to keep my hands busy, just to keep from losing my mind. The smell of the roast filled the house, a deceptive comfort that masked the tension rotting the foundation. When I finally carried the heavy platter to the dining room table, Tiffany was already seated at the head, my mother's seat. She was glowing, rubbing her belly, while my father poured her a glass of sparkling cider. I set the food down and pulled out the chair to my father's right. "Ah, actually, Damie," my father said, clearing his throat. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at the roast. "Maybe you could take a plate to your room. Tiffany's back is really hurting today, and she needs the extra space to stretch out. Plus, we have some private matters to discuss regarding the nursery." I froze, my hand gripping the back of the chair. "You want me to eat in my bedroom, like a child?" "Don't be difficult," Tiffany chimed in, spearing a potato. "Stress is bad for the baby. You understand, right?" "She's carrying your brother, Demi," my father added, his voice hardening. "Show some respect." I looked at the food I had cooked. I looked at the man who had raised me, now looking at me with nothing but annoyance. Without a word, I turned around, walked out of the dining room, and went straight to the kitchen. I didn't take a plate. I didn't eat. I just stood over the sink and drank a glass of tap water, letting the hunger gnaw at my stomach. It was better than choking on their hypocrisy. But the final blow came later that evening. My father knocked on my bedroom door, a rare occurrence. He stood in the hallway, refusing to cross the threshold. "We need to make changes," he said abruptly. "This room, it has the best light in the house. It's perfect for the nursery." My heart stopped. "This is my room. I've lived here since I was 5. "You're 32, Demi," he snapped. "It's time you grew up. But since you don't have a job or a husband to take care of you, I'm letting you stay. But you'll have to move downstairs." "Downstairs?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "You mean the basement?" "It's not that bad," he shrugged. "I'll have a contractor put up some drywall eventually. Put a space heater down there. It'll be private." The basement was unfinished. It was concrete floors, exposed pipes, and the smell of damp earth. It was where we stored holiday decorations and old tools. It wasn't a living space. It was a dungeon. "You're moving me into the basement so she can have my room." "She's the mother of my son," he said, as if that explained everything. "Pack your things. I want the room cleared by Tuesday." He closed the door, leaving me standing in the center of the room that held every secret, every tear, and every dream I'd ever had. I looked at the walls I'd painted, the window seat where I used to read, the spot on the rug where Mom and I used to fold laundry. It was all being confiscated. I spent that first night in the basement lying on an old mattress dragged onto the cold concrete floor. The air was heavy and damp, smelling of mold and neglect. Above me, I could hear their footsteps. I could hear them laughing. They were walking on top of me, literally and metaphorically. I lay there in the dark, listening to the pipes rattle, wondering if anyone in the world would blame me if I just walked away and let them win. It feels like the whole world is against you when your own parent treats you like trash. If you believe that no child, no matter their age, should ever be kicked to the curb for a replacement family, please hit that like button right now. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like a stranger in your own house? Type, I stand with Demi if you want to see me fight back. Staring up at the exposed wooden beams of the ceiling, the tears finally stopped. My father thought he was punishing me. He thought that by pushing me into the dark, he would break me. But he forgot one thing about the dark. It's where you go to develop photographs. It's where the picture finally becomes clear. He had stripped me of my room, my dignity, and my mother's memory. He thought I was powerless down here. But as I reached into my bag and felt the cold, hard edges of the blue box I had smuggled down with me, I realized something. He hadn't buried me. He had planted me. And tomorrow, I was going to see Mark. It was time to open the box. I waited until the sun had just started to bleed gray light through the basement's tiny hopper window before I made my move. Upstairs, the house was silent. My father's snoring had stopped, likely replaced by the heavy, dead sleep of a man who had drunk too much bourbon the night before. I crept up the stairs, my boots in my hand, avoiding the third step that always creaked. I wasn't escaping a prison. I was leaving an occupied war zone to meet with the resistance. Clutched tightly in my tote bag was the blue cedar box. It felt heavier than it looked, weighted down by secrets I hadn't dared to examine alone in the dark. I drove across town to Harry's Diner, a relic of the 1970s that smelled permanently of bacon grease, maple syrup, and stale cigarette smoke from decades past. It was the kind of place where the waitresses called you honey and poured coffee until your heart palpitated and nobody asked questions. It was also the last place my father would ever be caught dead. Mark was already there, sitting in a corner booth with peeling red vinyl seats. He looked out of place among the truckers and third-shift workers, wearing a rumpled gray suit that had seen better administrations. He had a half-eaten slice of cherry pie in front of him and a stack of legal pads. When he saw me, his face softened. A look of genuine, grandfatherly concern that I hadn't received from my own blood in years. "You look like hell, kiddo," he said softly as I slid into the booth opposite him. "I'm living in a basement, Mark," I whispered, clutching my bag. They moved me to the basement. Mark's jaw tightened, the muscles bunching up, but he didn't say a word. He just signaled the waitress, who immediately dropped a heavy ceramic mug in front of me and filled it with steaming, weak brown liquid. "Drink," Mark ordered gently, "and show me the box." I pulled the cedar box onto the sticky laminate table. My hands were shaking as I undid the small brass latch. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a thick document bound in blue paper. Mark put on his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the pages. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. "Your mother was a smart woman, Demi," he said, tapping the document with a thick finger. "She knew." "Knew what?" "She knew Robert was going to betray her," Mark said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "This isn't just a will. This is a revocable living trust that became irrevocable the moment she passed. She transferred the deed to the house, her life insurance policies, and her investment accounts into this trust 6 months ago." I stared at him, the noise of the diner fading away. "But Dad said," he said he was the executor. "He said I was incompetent." "He lied," Mark said simply. "He's counting on you being too broken to check. He's counting on you believing that because he's your father, he has the power. But legally, he controls nothing. You are the sole trustee, Demi." I felt a wave of dizziness. Why? Why did she do it this way? Why didn't she tell him? Mark sighed, taking a long sip of his coffee. He looked pained, like he was deciding whether to pull a bandage off slowly or rip it off all at once. Because of what happened in November. November? Mom was in her second round of chemo. Exactly, Mark said. And while she was in the hospital fighting for her life, your father called my office. He wanted to do a cash-out refinance on the house. He wanted to pull out $100,000 of equity. The air left my lungs. $100,000 for medical bills. Mark shook his head slowly. No. The insurance was covering the bulk of the treatment. He said he needed it for investments. But I did some digging. He had been looking at condos downtown, leases for luxury apartments. I felt sick. The cherry pie on the table suddenly looked revolting. While my mother was vomiting from chemotherapy, my father was trying to mortgage our family home to set up a love nest for Tiffany. He was planning to leave her, I whispered, the realization cold and hard in my stomach. He was going to take the money and leave her to die alone. But he couldn't, Mark said, a glint of steel entering his eyes. Because the house wasn't just in his name. Sarah refused to sign the papers. That was the day she called me to set up this trust. She knew Demi. She knew exactly who he was. And she made sure that when she was gone, he wouldn't get a single dime of her legacy. I looked down at the document. It was a shield. My mother hadn't just left me money. She had left me protection. She had reached out from the grave to stop him from hurting me. So we can kick them out? I asked, a surge of hope rising in my chest. I can go home right now and tell them to leave? No, Mark said sharply. Absolutely not. Why not? It's my house. Because right now, you have a piece of paper. If you show your hand today, he will fight you. He'll drag this out in probate court for years, claiming you coerced a dying woman. He has expensive lawyers who fight dirty. And he has that girl and the grandson she's carrying. Judges in family court have a soft spot for pregnant women. Mark leaned across the table, his expression intense. We don't just want the house, Demi. We want to destroy his credibility. We need to prove he is unfit. And we need to find out the truth about that baby. I have a private investigator looking into Tiffany. Her background is colorful. But we need more. So what do? I asked, feeling the weight of the task settling on my shoulders. You go back there, Mark said. And you act like the defeated daughter. You let them treat you like the maid. You let them think they've won. Because when people think they've won, they get sloppy. They leave phones unlocked. They leave bank statements on the counter. They talk loudly in the next room. He paused, looking at me with intense seriousness. There's a quote by Ruth Bader Ginsburg I want you to remember. Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. He pointed a fork at me. Don't let your anger burn the house down. Use it as fuel. Be smart. Be patient. Can you do that? I thought about the basement. I thought about the cold concrete floor and Tiffany's laughter. I thought about my father trying to sell our home to fund his affair. I finished my coffee in one long gulp. It was bitter, but it woke me up. I can do it, I said, closing the blue box. I'll go back to the dungeon. But I'm not just the maid anymore, Mark. I'm the spy. Mark smiled, a genuine shark-like grin this time. Good girl. Now get out of here before the breakfast rush. And hide that box better than you hid your teenage diary. I walked out of the diner and into the bright morning sun. The world looked the same as it had an hour ago. Cars were driving by, people were walking their dogs. But everything had changed. I wasn't an orphan anymore. I was a soldier on a mission, armed with a dead woman's love and a lawyer's strategy. I got into my car and turned the key. It was time to go home and put on the performance of a lifetime. I spent the next 3 days perfecting the art of being invisible. I scrubbed floors until my knees were bruised. I ironed my father's shirts until the starch was stiff enough to cut glass, and I kept my head down whenever Tiffany entered a room. I was the perfect, defeated daughter. I was the maid. But underneath the apron, I was counting the seconds, waiting for them to make a mistake. That mistake happened on a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Robert, honey, the baby is doing that thing again, Tiffany whined, clutching her stomach as she leaned against the kitchen island. She was wearing a tight pink tracksuit that left little to the imagination. It feels tight. I think we need to go to the doctor, just to be safe. My father dropped his spoon into his oatmeal, panic flashing across his face. Is it contractions? It's too early for contractions. I don't know, she gasped, squeezing her eyes shut. I just need to see Dr. Evans at Mercy Hospital, right now. Okay, I'm getting the car, he said, knocking his chair over in his haste. He turned to me, barking an order without even looking at my face. Demi, clean up this mess. And don't wait up. We might be there a while. I watched from the living room window as his black Lexus backed out of the driveway, speeding down the suburban street. As soon as the taillights disappeared around the corner, the submissive daughter act vanished. I didn't clean the oatmeal. I ran straight to my father's study. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and secrets. It was a space I hadn't been allowed to enter since I was 12, a shrine to Robert Porter's ego, lined with leather-bound books he never read and trophies from golf tournaments he hadn't really won. I went straight to the heavy oak desk. It was locked, of course. My father was paranoid about his privacy, but he was also a creature of habit. I walked over to the bookshelf where he kept a display of antique ammunition boxes. I reached for the faded green Remington shotgun shell box on the top shelf, the one he'd kept since a hunting trip in 1998. I shook it. A metallic clink answered me. Gotcha, I whispered. I slid the small brass key into the desk drawer lock. It turned with a satisfying click. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe a will, maybe letters. But what I found was a chaotic mess of crumpled papers shoved to the back of the drawer, hidden underneath a stack of old Golf Digest magazines. It was a pile of bank statements, unopened, mostly. My father, the man who used to lecture me about balancing a checkbook to the penny, hadn't opened his own mail in months. I tore open the most recent statement from Chase Bank. My eyes scanned the columns, looking for the usual utility bills or mortgage payments. Instead, I saw a pattern that made my stomach churn. Silver Star Casino and Resort. ATM withdrawal, $500. Silver Star Casino and Resort. ATM withdrawal, $500. Silver Star Casino and Resort. ATM withdrawal, $1,000. The list went on and on, page after page of withdrawals. The dates coincided with the nights he told Mom he was working late at the office. He wasn't working. He was driving 40 miles to the reservation casino, feeding his paycheck into the high-limit slot machines, or blowing it at the blackjack tables. The fees alone were staggering, $9.99 for every transaction. It was the desperate, sloppy behavior of an addict. But then I found the document that made me stop breathing. It was a quarterly statement for a Virginia 529 college savings plan. This was the fund my mother had started the year I graduated college. She had put away $50 a month, every single month for 10 years. For the grandbabies, she used to say, her eyes twinkling. So they won't have student loans like you did, Demi. I looked at the balance. Zero Puzdro. Zero. There was a transaction note from 3 weeks ago. Early withdrawal. Full liquidation. Penalty applied. I fell back into the leather office chair, the paper shaking in my hand. He hadn't just gambled away his own money. He had stolen the future. He had drained the education fund meant for his grandchildren, my children, or even Tiffany's child, if it was real, just to cover his losses at the Silver Star. He had paid a 10% tax penalty just to get his hands on the cash quickly. The rage that surged through me was so hot it felt like I had swallowed a coal. I wanted to burn the desk. I wanted to burn the whole house. Suddenly my cell phone buzzed in my pocket, shattering the silence. It was Mark. Demi. His voice was tight, urgent. Are you alone? Yes, I choked out, staring at the empty 529 statement. Mark, he stole it. He stole the college fund. He's gambling it all away. We'll get to that, Mark said, cutting me off. But you need to listen to me. My private investigator, Sam, is tailing them right now. They're at Mercy Hospital, I said. Tiffany was having pains. Mark let out a short, dark laugh. Demi, they aren't at Mercy. Your father dropped her off at the front entrance, yes. But she didn't check in. She walked straight through the lobby, out the emergency exit in the back, and hopped onto the back of a Harley-Davidson. I blinked, trying to process the image. A motorcycle? A Harley, Mark confirmed. Ridden by a guy who looks to be about 25. Leather vest, tattoos, the works. Sam is following them. They just pulled into a motel off the interstate. The Red River Inn. It's not exactly a place for prenatal care. And my father? Sitting in the waiting room at Mercy Hospital, Mark said, his voice dripping with disdain. Reading a magazine, probably thinking about what a great patriarch he is, waiting for his soulmate to finish her checkup. I looked down at the bank statements scattered on the desk, the evidence of thousands of dollars wasted, the empty college fund, and now the picture of my father, arrogant, cruel Robert Porter, sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, worrying about a fake pregnancy while his money funded a motel room for his girlfriend and her biker lover. He's not just a thief, I whispered, a strange sensation washing over me. It wasn't pity. It was disgust. He's a fool. He destroyed our family for a woman who is playing him like a fiddle. Exactly, Mark said. And that makes him dangerous. But it also makes him vulnerable. Take pictures of those bank statements, Demi. Every single page. Then put them back exactly how you found them. We have the financial motive. Now, we just need the DNA. DNA? If she's sleeping with Biker Boy, Mark said, there's a very good chance the heir your father is so obsessed with doesn't share a drop of Porter blood. We just need to prove it. I hung up the phone. My hands were steady now. I snapped photos of every incriminating line, every casino withdrawal, every zero balance. Then I carefully restacked the papers, shoved them under the golf magazines, locked the drawer, and replaced the key in the shotgun shell box. I walked out of the study and picked up the mop bucket. I went back to scrubbing the floors, the rhythm of the brush against the wood matching the beating of my heart. Scrub, rinse, wait. They thought I was the maid. They didn't know I was the executioner. And the guillotine was getting sharper by the minute. I didn't turn on the lights when I heard the heavy thud of the garage door opening. I just sat in the wingback chair by the fireplace, the glow of the dying embers casting long, dancing shadows across the room. On the coffee table in front of me sat the stack of printed bank statements, highlighted in neon yellow. The front door opened, letting in a gust of freezing wind and the sound of my father's laughter. It was a boisterous, bourbon-soaked laugh that grated on my nerves. I'm telling you, Tiff, he boomed, stumbling slightly as he crossed the threshold. That steakhouse was incredible. Nothing but the best for my boy. You spoil us, Robert, Tiffany cooed, hanging onto his arm. She spotted me sitting in the semi-darkness and jumped. Jesus, you scared me. What are you doing sitting there like a creep? I didn't look at her. I looked straight at him. We need to talk about the college fund, Dad. The laughter died instantly. My father straightened up, his face hardening into that familiar mask of irritation. I'm tired, Demi. I don't have time for your drama. You didn't have time to open your mail either, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding against my ribs like a sledgehammer. I pointed to the papers. I know about Silver Star. I know you liquidated the 529 plan. $50,000, Dad. Mom saved that for 20 years. And you blew it on slot machines and... I glanced at Tiffany. Motel rooms. You went through my desk? His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. How dare you? I'm your father. I am the head of this house. You're a thief. I stood up, screaming now, the rage finally uncorked. That wasn't your money to touch. It was for the grandchildren you claim to want so badly. But you don't want a family. You want an audience. Shut up, he roared. He grabbed the framed photo on the mantel, the one of the three of us from my college graduation, back when we were a real family, and hurled it across the room. Crash. The glass shattered against the wall, shards exploding onto the hardwood floor. The photo, my mother's smiling face, lay face down in the debris. You are exactly like her, he spat, stepping over the broken glass, his finger pointed at my face. Always nagging, always counting pennies. You're boring, Demi. You're useless. Just like Sarah was. I need a legacy. I need a son who can actually do something with his life, not a bitter spinster living in my basement. Don't you dare talk about her, I hissed, stepping forward. That was when Tiffany made her move. She wasn't even part of the argument, but she saw an opportunity. As I took that single step toward my father, she let out a shriek and threw herself backward onto the sofa. Ah, she pushed me, she screamed, clutching her stomach and writhing theatrically. Robert, she hit the baby. She's trying to kill him. I froze. I hadn't even touched her. I was 3 feet away. What? I didn't. I never finished the sentence. My father didn't look. He didn't ask. He just swung. Crack. His open palm connected with my cheek with the force of a whip. The sound was sickeningly loud in the sudden silence of the room. My head snapped to the side, and I tasted copper. I stumbled back, clutching my face, staring at him in shock. He had never hit me. Not once in 32 years. Not when I wrecked his car in high school. Not when I dropped out of law school. But now, for a lie told by a woman he'd known for 4 months, he had struck me. He stood there, chest heaving, his hand still raised. For a second, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But then he looked at Tiffany, wailing on the couch with dry eyes, and the regret hardened into ice. Get out, he whispered. Dad! I said get out, he screamed, his voice cracking. Get your trash and get out of my house. If you are still on this property in 10 minutes, I am calling the cops. I'll have you arrested for assault and trespassing. Try me, Demi. Try me. I looked at him, really looked at him. The man in the expensive suit was gone. All that was left was a pathetic, terrified bully protecting a lie. You're going to regret this, I said quietly. My voice didn't shake. Not because I'm going to hurt you, but because you just lost the only person on earth who actually loved you. I didn't pack everything. I didn't have time. I ran down to the basement, grabbed my duffel bag, threw in a few clothes, my laptop, and, most importantly, the blue cedar box. 10 minutes later, I was standing on the front lawn. The winter sky had opened up, dumping a miserable mix of sleet and snow onto the driveway. The wind bit through my thin coat, stinging the red handprint that was swelling on my cheek. My father opened the front door and threw my heavy winter boots out onto the snow. They landed with a thud near my feet. Don't come back, he shouted over the wind. You're dead to us. The door slammed. The deadbolt slid home with a finality that echoed in my bones. I stood there in the freezing sleet, shivering not from the cold, but from the shock of being discarded like garbage by my own flesh and blood. It is a pain I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. If you believe that no father has the right to raise a hand against his daughter, please hit that like button to show your support. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been pushed to the edge by family? Type, I stand with Demi, if you want to see me take them down. I picked up my boots and walked to my rusted Ford pickup truck parked at the curb. My hands were numb as I fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, coughing out gray smoke that mingled with the snow. I sat in the cab for a moment, letting the heater blast against my frozen fingers. I looked up at the house one last time. I could see the silhouette of my father in the living room window, pouring himself another drink, probably celebrating his victory. He thought he had won. He thought he had kicked the dog out into the cold and that the dog would just whimper and run away. He was wrong. I put the truck into gear and pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching on the ice. I touched the burning skin of my cheek. It hurt, but the pain was good. It was fuel. Enjoy your drink, Dad, I whispered to the rearview mirror. Because it's the last peaceful night you're going to have. I wasn't the daughter anymore. I was the plaintiff, and court was about to be in session. The sound of Mark tearing the red tape off that manila envelope snapped me violently back to the present. The freezing sleet of that winter night and the image of my father throwing my boots into the snow evaporated, replaced instantly by the sterile, fluorescent reality of the courtroom. I was no longer the shivering girl in the driveway. I was the plaintiff. And my father, sitting in the witness stand with a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead, was about to realize that the daughter he had discarded was holding the match that would burn his house of cards to the ground. Mr. Porter, Mark said, his voice deceptively mild as he paced in front of the witness stand. You've given quite a moving testimony. You claim that you were Sarah's sole caregiver, her rock, during those final, agonizing months. I was, my father said, adjusting his silk tie. He looked at the judge, Judge Miller, with practiced sincerity. It was the hardest time of my life, Your Honor. Watching the woman I loved fade away. I was there every single night. While my daughter, he shot a venomous look at me, was out partying or ignoring her mother's calls. Demi abandoned us when we needed her most. She's unstable, always has been. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. The lie was so bold, so grotesque, that it almost took my breath away. He was rewriting history, painting himself as the martyr and me as the villain, using the very abandonment he had orchestrated against me. Is that so? Mark asked, walking back to our table. He picked up a document. Because, Mr. Porter, we have subpoenaed the GPS records from your vehicle, alongside your bank statements from that period. Strange, for a devoted husband sitting by his dying wife's bedside, your car seemed to be parked quite often at the Silver Star Casino. 40 miles away. My father blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a hook. I went there to clear my head. The stress, it was too much. To clear your head, Mark repeated, his voice sharpening. And did clearing your head require liquidating your wife's $529 college savings plan, the fund she started for her future grandchildren? Mark slapped the paper onto the railing of the witness stand. Exhibit A, Your Honor, a withdrawal of $50,000, followed by a series of losses at the blackjack tables totaling $48,000 in 3 weeks. A ripple of murmurs went through the courtroom. Judge Miller picked up the evidence, his eyebrows knitting together as he looked from the paper to my father. That was for medical bills, my father stammered, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. You don't understand the costs. The insurance didn't cover everything. We have the insurance statements too, Mr. Porter, Mark said coldly. Every penny was covered. You stole from your unborn grandchildren to pay for your gambling addiction. My father was cornered, but like a rat, he snapped back. He straightened his spine, pivoting to his second line of defense. Fine, maybe I made some bad calls with money. I'm human. But that doesn't change the fact that the will is invalid. Sarah wasn't in her right mind when she signed that trust. He pointed a shaking finger at me. That girl manipulated a dying woman. Sarah had, what do the doctors call it? Chemo brain. She had dementia setting in. She didn't know what she was doing. She thought I was a stranger half the time. She would never have cut me out if she were sane. The gallery gasped. It was the lowest blow imaginable, using my mother's suffering to rob her of her agency. Mark didn't flinch. He walked back to the table and picked up another document. This one was thick, stamped with the seal of Mercy Hospital. I'm glad you brought up Sarah's mental state, Mark said. Because I have here a sworn affidavit from Dr. Evans, her primary oncologist, as well as the notes from her neurological exam conducted 2 days before she signed the trust documents. Mark handed the file to the bailiff to give to the judge. Exhibit B, Dr. Evans states quite clearly that Sarah Porter was fully oriented, lucid, and cognitively sharp until 48 hours before her death. She knew exactly who you were, Mr. Porter. And she knew exactly what you were doing. My father slumped in the chair. The devoted husband act was crumbling. The grieving widower mask was slipping. Now he just looked like what he was, a greedy, desperate man caught in a lie. But Mark wasn't done. He turned his back on my father and walked toward Tiffany, who was sitting in the front row. She was wearing a modest pastel dress, clutching her belly, looking wide-eyed and innocent. However, Mark said, spinning around to face my father again, let's put the past aside. Let's talk about the future. You mentioned earlier that the reason you need control of the estate, the reason you need Sarah's life insurance money, is to provide for your new family. For your son. That's right, my father said, grasping at the lifeline. His voice gained a little strength. I have a son on the way, a male heir. I have a responsibility to him. Sarah would have wanted me to be happy, to raise him right. A male heir, Mark mused. You seem very certain. We had an ultrasound, my father scoffed. It's a boy. My bloodline. Mark nodded slowly. He walked back to our table and picked up the manila envelope, the one he had ripped open just moments ago. He held it up. It looked harmless, just a piece of paper in a sleeve, but the air in the room seemed to vanish. You see, Mr. Porter, Mark said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated with danger. When we investigated your financial irregularities, we found some interesting travel patterns regarding Ms. Tiffany Miller, specifically her visits to the Red River Inn motel. Tiffany let out a small squeak. My father frowned. What are you talking about? We hired a private investigator, Mark continued, ignoring the objection rising from my father's lawyer. And we obtained a DNA sample. You see, since you are claiming this child has a right to the Porter estate, his paternity is a matter of legal interest. Mark pulled a single sheet of paper from the envelope. This is a prenatal paternity test. Court admissible standards, Mark said. He looked at my father, and for the first time, I saw pity in his eyes. You keep talking about your bloodline, Robert. You keep talking about how Demi isn't enough, how you needed a son to carry your name. Stop it, my father whispered, his eyes darting to Tiffany. She was pale as a sheet, her hand over her mouth. The test results are conclusive, Mark said, his voice ringing out like a gavel strike. Would you like to read them to the court, or shall I? The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolutely electric. My father looked at Tiffany. She didn't look back. She was looking at the exit, and in that split second, before a word was read, my father knew. The trap had snapped shut. The silence in courtroom 4B was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library, it was the suffocating, heavy silence of a bomb squad watching a timer tick down to 0. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, waiting. Judge Miller took the single sheet of paper from the bailiff. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, squinting slightly under the fluorescent lights. He read it once. Then he read it again, his eyebrows shooting up toward his hairline. He cleared his throat, a sound that cracked through the room like a gunshot. The court has reviewed Exhibit C, Judge Miller announced, his voice devoid of emotion, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of disbelief. This is a court-ordered, non-invasive prenatal paternity test, comparing the DNA of Mr. Robert Porter and the fetal DNA obtained via maternal blood sample. My father was leaning forward, gripping the railing of the witness stand so hard his knuckles were white. He was still trying to maintain his dignity, still trying to play the role of the aggrieved patriarch. Tiffany was staring at her lap, picking at a loose thread on her pastel dress. The results are as follows, the judge continued, looking directly at my father. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The numbers hung in the air, absolute and unforgiving, 0.00. Then the room exploded. A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed immediately by a wave of excited whispers. It was the sound of a small-town scandal breaking open in real time. No! My father's shout cut through the noise. He stood up so abruptly that his chair screeching backwards sounded like a dying animal. That's a lie. That's a fake document. She's carrying my son. We saw the ultrasound. Sit down, Mr. Porter, Judge Miller barked, banging his gavel. I will not sit down, my father roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He turned wildly toward our table, pointing a shaking finger at Mark. You planted that. You and that ungrateful girl cooked this up to steal my legacy. Then he spun toward Tiffany. She hadn't moved. She hadn't looked up. Tiffany, tell them, he pleaded, his voice cracking from rage to desperation. Tell them it's mine. Tell them about the names we picked out. Tell them! Tiffany finally looked up. And the transformation was terrifying. The sweet, doe-eyed girl who had sat there clutching her belly and acting the victim was gone. In her place was a woman with eyes as cold as flint and a sneer that twisted her pretty face into something ugly. Oh, shut up, Robert, she snapped. The gallery went silent again. My father recoiled as if she had slapped him. What? What did you say? I said shut up, Tiffany said, her voice rising, shedding the soft, feminine octave she had used to charm him for months. It was harsh now, grating and raw. God, you are so pathetic. Do you really think I wanted to have a baby with a 60-year-old man who smells like cigars and Bengay? But we're soulmates, my father stammered, looking like a child lost in a supermarket. I bought you the car. I rented the condo. You rented it, Tiffany screamed, standing up now, abandoning all pretense. You rented everything. You promised me you were rich, Robert. You told me you had millions in investments. But you're broke. You're a cheapskate who has to steal from his dead wife's savings just to buy me a purse. I did it for us. You did it because you're a loser, she yelled back, and the venom in her voice was toxic. I checked your credit score, Robert. It's lower than your IQ. You have nothing. You have a mortgage you can't pay and a gambling addiction that's burning through cash faster than I can spend it. She placed a protective hand over her belly, but the gesture didn't look maternal anymore. It looked possessive. This baby deserves a father who isn't one foot in the grave and the other in bankruptcy court, she hissed. Brian is twice the man you are. Brian, my father whispered the name. The mechanic? The guy you hired to fix your precious Lexus, Tiffany laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. Yeah, he's young, he's hot, and unlike you, he doesn't need a little blue pill to get through the night. The courtroom erupted. The bailiff stepped forward, hand on his holster, shouting for order. Judge Miller was hammering the gavel so hard I thought the handle would snap. But I didn't look at the judge. I watched my father. It happened in slow motion. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, waxen gray. The arrogance, the bluster, the towering ego that had terrified me my entire life, it all evaporated. He didn't have a heart attack. It was worse. His spirit broke, his knees buckled, and he collapsed back into the witness chair, clutching his chest, gasping for air. He looked small. He looked old. He looked completely destroyed. His eyes frantically scanned the room, looking for an anchor, looking for anyone who would look at him with something other than contempt. His gaze landed on Tiffany, but she was busy texting on her phone, probably telling Brian to bring the bike around. Then, his eyes found mine. For the first time in years, he truly saw me. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading intensity. His lips moved, forming a silent word. Demi. He wanted me to rush to him. He wanted me to be the dutiful daughter who would hold his hand, comfort him, and tell him it would be okay. He wanted me to save him from the humiliation he had brought upon himself. I felt a pang in my chest, the old reflex of a child trained to please. But then I felt the phantom sting of his hand on my cheek from the night he kicked me out into the snow. I remembered the college fund he stole. I remembered my mother dying while he looked at condos. I didn't look away. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just looked at him with the detached curiosity of a stranger watching a car crash. I held his gaze for 3 seconds, letting him see that the well was dry. There was no pity left. Then I turned my back on him and looked at Mark. I think, Mark said quietly, over the roar of the courtroom, that concludes our cross-examination. My father let out a sob, a broken guttural sound that was lost in the noise of the gavel finally bringing down the hammer of justice. The show was over. The curtains had fallen, and Robert Porter was left alone on the stage, buried under the wreckage of his own lies. Judgment is entered in favor of the plaintiff. Judge Miller's voice was dry, devoid of the theatricality that had consumed the courtroom just an hour earlier. It was a simple administrative statement, yet it landed with the weight of a guillotine blade. Mr. Porter is ordered to pay full restitution to the Sarah Porter Trust in the amount of $50,000, plus legal fees and court costs. Furthermore, a permanent restraining order is granted, barring Mr. Porter from dissipating any further marital assets until the estate is fully settled. The gavel banged one last time. Thud. It was over. I looked across the aisle. My father sat slumped in his chair, his expensive suit now looking like a costume that didn't fit. He didn't look up. He stared at the polished wood of the defense table, his hands trembling slightly. There was no rage left in him, only the hollowed-out shell of a man who had bet everything on a pair of deuces and lost. Mark squeezed my shoulder. You did it, Demi. It's done. Yeah, I whispered, gathering my papers. It's done. I expected to feel a surge of triumph. I expected to feel the adrenaline of victory, the kind you see in movies where the hero walks out to slow-motion applause. Instead, I felt a profound, aching emptiness. Winning a lawsuit against your own father isn't a victory. It's an autopsy. You might find the cause of death, but you're still left with a corpse. We walked out of the courtroom and into the long, echoing hallway. The crowds had dispersed, chasing the next scandal. It was just the quiet hum of the HVAC system and the sound of our footsteps on the marble floor. I'll handle the paperwork for the restitution, Mark said, sensing my mood. Go home, kiddo. Get some rest. You look like you've gone 12 rounds. I nodded and pushed through the heavy double doors, stepping out into the biting winter air. The sleet from the night I was kicked out had turned into a gray, hardened slush. I walked toward the parking lot, pulling my coat tighter around me. That's when I heard the unmistakable mechanical whine of hydraulics. In the reserved parking spots near the entrance, a scene of grim urban reality was unfolding. A large flatbed tow truck, an asset recovery vehicle, had backed up to my father's black Lexus. A man in a high-vis vest was efficiently hooking chains to the undercarriage. Standing 10 feet away, watching his status symbol being hoisted into the air, was Robert Porter. He looked small against the gray sky. He wasn't wearing his overcoat. He was shivering, his arms wrapped around himself, watching the bank repossess the last tangible piece of his ego. He hadn't just lost the case. He had missed 3 months of payments. The facade wasn't just cracking, it was being towed away to an impound lot in New Jersey. He turned his head and saw me. For a moment, I thought about walking past him. I thought about getting into my rusted Ford truck and driving away without a word. But he moved faster than I expected. He shuffled toward me, his movements jerky and desperate. "Demi," he croaked. His voice was rough, stripped of its booming baritone. I stopped. I didn't step closer, but I didn't run. I stood my ground, keeping a car's length between us. "They took the car," he said, gesturing vaguely at the tow truck. "Can you believe it? After all the business I gave that dealership." I said nothing. I just watched him. He took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "Demi, listen. That girl, Tiffany, she tricked me. You saw her in there. She's a monster. She preyed on me. I was vulnerable after your mother died, and she took advantage of an old man's grief." "Is that what you think happened?" I asked quietly. "It's the truth," he insisted, his eyes widening. "I was a victim, just like you. I didn't know she was lying about the baby. If I had known. Do you think I would have treated you that way? We're family, Demi. You're my daughter." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air, waiting for me to take it. Waiting for me to fix it. "You can't leave me here, Demi," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't have a car. I don't have anyone. I'm old. I made a mistake, but I'm still your father." I looked at his hand. It was the same hand that had struck my face. It was the same hand that had signed the withdrawal slip for the college fund. It was the same hand that had thrown my boots into the snow. A strange clarity washed over me. The anger that had fueled me for weeks finally burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. "You weren't tricked, Dad," I said, my voice steady and clear in the cold air. "You didn't believe Tiffany because she was a master manipulator. You chose to believe her lies because they stroked your ego. You wanted to believe you were young and virile and important. You wanted that more than you wanted to be a decent father." He recoiled as if I had slapped him. "How can you be so cruel? I have nothing left." "You have exactly what you invested in," I said. "You invested in lies, and this is the return." "So that's it?" he spat, a flash of his old malice returning as panic set in. "You're just going to abandon me, your own flesh and blood?" I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel afraid of him. I didn't feel the need to please him. I felt free. "I'm not abandoning you," I said. "I'm just returning you to the place you belong, solitude." "Demi," he shouted as I turned away. "Demi, come back here. You owe me. I raised you." I kept walking. The sound of his voice became background noise, mixing with the rumble of the tow truck driving away with his Lexus. I reached my truck. My ugly, rusted, dependable truck that I had paid for with my own money. I climbed into the cab and locked the door. Through the window, I saw him standing there in the slush, a lonely figure in an expensive suit, shouting at a daughter who could no longer hear him. I put the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, loud and defiant. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the lot. I didn't need to see him get smaller and smaller until he disappeared. He was already gone. The road ahead was gray and wet. But as I turned onto the main highway, the clouds parted just enough for a single ray of winter sun to hit the pavement. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was messy and painful and sad. But as I drove toward the horizon, I realized something that made me smile for the first time in months. The silence in the truck wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. It took me 6 months to fully exorcise the ghost from the house. I didn't just clean it, I purged it. The heavy dark velvet drapes that Tiffany had bought with my mother's credit card were the first to go, stuffed into trash bags and hauled to the curb. I repainted the living room a soft, warm sage green, a color my mother had always loved but my father had forbidden because it wasn't masculine enough. I tore up the carpet in the hallway where I'd been slapped, revealing the beautiful, honey-colored original hardwood underneath. But the real healing happened in the garden. Early that spring, I went back to the patch of earth where Tiffany had dumped the strawberry jam. I dug up the soil, turning it over with a spade until my muscles burned. I planted 3 rows of new strawberry plants, reclaiming the ground. I wasn't just gardening, I was taking back my history, root by root. I didn't stop there. I used the settlement money not to buy luxury cars or designer clothes, but to build a legacy. I started a small business called Sarah's Care. It was a specialized home care service for the elderly, dedicated to providing the kind of dignified, compassionate companionship that my mother had received in her final days, and that my father, in his arrogance, had failed to value. My life had become quiet, but it was a rich, deliberate kind of quiet. It was the silence of a library, not the silence of a tomb. Then, exactly 1 year after the trial, the letter arrived. It came in a plain, thin, white envelope with a return address stamped in cheap blue ink. Pine Creek Care Center. I knew the place. It was a state-funded nursing home on the outskirts of the county, the kind of facility where people went when they had burned every bridge and drained every bank account. It was the last stop for the destitute. I sat on my front porch swing, staring at the envelope for a long time before sliding my finger under the flap. The handwriting inside was shaky, barely legible, a spider scrawl that looked nothing like the bold, arrogant signature that used to sign checks with such flourish. Demi, it read. The doctors say it's congestive heart failure. Funny. You'd probably say I never had a heart to begin with. I'm not writing to ask for money. I know I lost that right. I'm writing because the nights are long here, and all I see when I close my eyes is you standing in the snow. I was wrong about everything. I don't expect you to come. But I had to say it. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I looked out at the garden, watching a red cardinal land on the bird feeder. I could have thrown the letter away. I could have let him die alone, just as I had promised in the parking lot. But hate is heavy, and I was tired of carrying heavy things. I drove to Pine Creek the next morning. The facility smelled of bleach and boiled cabbage, a stark contrast to the country club scent of leather and expensive cologne that used to cling to my father. I found him in room 302. He was sharing the cramped space with another man who was loudly watching a game show on a fuzzy TV. When I saw him, I almost didn't recognize him. The Robert Porter in the bed was a skeleton wrapped in papery skin. His hair was gone, his cheeks sunken. The Armani suits were a distant memory, replaced by a faded hospital gown that tied in the back. He opened his eyes when he heard my footsteps. When he saw me, his breath hitched. Demi, he whispered. A tear leaked out of the corner of his eye and tracked through the deep lines of his face. You came. I came, I said softly. I pulled a metal chair up to the bedside. I didn't hug him. I didn't cry. The deep, visceral bond of father and daughter had been severed too severely to be retied with a simple bow. But there was something else in the room, a quiet, somber acknowledgement of our shared humanity. "I'm sorry," he wheezed, his hand twitching on the sheet. I was chasing a ghost, Demi. I wanted to be young again. I wanted to be important. And I threw away the only two people who ever actually saw me. "I know, Dad," I said. I reached out and covered his hand with mine. His skin was cold. "I know. Can you ever forgive me?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the beep of the heart monitor. I looked at him. I thought about the basement. I thought about the courtroom. I thought about the woman I had become because of the fire he put me through. "Forgiveness isn't for you, Dad," I said gently. "It's for me. I forgive you. Not because what you did was okay, but because I refuse to let your mistakes define the rest of my life. I'm letting you go." He nodded, closing his eyes, and for the first time in years, the tension left his face. He looked peaceful. He died 3 days later. There was no grand funeral, no potluck with gossip-hungry neighbors. Just a small graveside service with me, the priest, and a few of his old golf buddies who bothered to show up. I buried him next to Mom. Not because he deserved it, but because she would have wanted him there. She was always the better half of us, the one who believed in redemption until the very end. That evening, I sat in the backyard under the giant red maple tree my mother had planted when I was born. It was autumn, and the leaves were a blazing canopy of crimson and gold, catching the last rays of the setting sun. I held a mug of hot tea in my hands, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. The air was crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and wood smoke. I looked at the house. My house. It wasn't a prison anymore. It was a sanctuary. I thought about the clients I would see tomorrow, the elderly men and women who held my hands and told me stories about their lives. I was building a family of my own making, a community stitched together by care rather than blood. I remembered a quote by Maya Angelou that Mark had sent me in a card after the funeral. "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." I took a sip of tea and smiled as the wind rustled the red leaves above me. My father had tried to break me. He had tried to bury me in the basement, in the dark, under the weight of his own insecurities. But he didn't know that I was a seed. I had broken through the concrete. I had weathered the winter storm. And now, sitting under the glowing canopy of my mother's legacy, I was finally, truly, blooming. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my journey, it is that your worth is never defined by how others treat you, even if that person is your own parent. We are often taught that enduring abuse is a form of loyalty, but protecting your peace is actually the highest form of self-respect. Remember the lesson of the seed. Sometimes when life feels like it has buried you in darkness, you haven't been destroyed. You've been planted. Don't fear those difficult seasons. Use them to grow roots so deep that no storm can ever knock you down again. Now, I want to turn this over to you. Have you ever had to make the heartbreaking choice to walk away from a family member to save yourself? Or have you found peace in forgiving someone who wasn't sorry? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's turn this comment section into a safe space where we can support each other's healing. And if you believe that family is built on love and respect, not just DNA, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story of resilience. Remember, you are never alone.